because it's the central part of the brain, right? Right in the middle of it all. That's the thalamus, right? And so this brings us into those regions of the brain that it's projecting to. So over the, before any kind of modern brain imaging and stuff like that, people, neuroscientists, primitive neuroscientists would like take people who like, especially people who came from war, like World War I was a big boom for studying brain function because people had all these brain injuries, right? And they had a brain injury right over here, and they couldn't recognize faces or like locations of things or something. They had a brain injury over here, and they couldn't like name objects, or they couldn't speak right. Or they had a brain injury here, and they could read or something, but they couldn't speak words, right? They had a brain injury over here, and they had like blind spots in their vision, right? So
I
they kind
can't
of
see the arrows.
Oh, well, it's just these numbers. It doesn't matter where I'm saying, but yeah, I don't know why. Sometimes my arrow disappears, but thank you.
Okay, thank you.
In case any of these, like I said, this area might be damaged and they couldn't understand speech. This area might be damaged and they couldn't produce speech. This area might be damaged and they don't recognize faces or something, or like individuals or something like weird, very weird things. This area was damaged and they lost all moral inhibition, right? So the brain functions were highly localized to very particular parts of the brain, right? And that was all done by damage, right? Or, you do it in animals, you kind of destroy certain areas of the brain, and what's the deficit? Nowadays, you can actually take imaging, right, and kind of monitor the activity of certain areas of the brain, which we'll kind of talk about a little bit. But the key line here is that all these areas over here are highly specialized for certain very particular functions. So first off, let's just look at the gross anatomy, looking at the cerebrum over here, right? This is a lateral view. You got all these different lobes, which I'll talk about in a second, right? The different lobes that are going to correspond to the skull areas you learned about. This is a superior view over here, looking down, looking at this big split in between the left and right hemisphere. This is a coronal section right here, where you can see these big internal spaces that we'll find out of the ventricles, as well as some of these, all the curves in here, right? So this, as far as what the cerebrum is basically, this whole thing that you can see. This is the cerebellum, not the cerebrum. This over here is the cerebrum. This whole thing is a cerebrum, right? In particular, the wrinkly parts are part, the outside part. And then basically everything here is the cerebrum. Okay. So this is the cerebrum, or, the telencephalon, you could also call it. So from this coronal section, again, get used to thinking of those terms because you'll do this a lot in the other classes with all your other systems. Coronal section. So what we're going to see about the organization, right, is going to be this outer layer on the outside of gray matter, an outer cerebral cortex, this dark, this brown tannish stuff on the outside, and then you're going to have white matter on the inside, right? And what is white matter? White matter is myelinated axons. What is gray matter? It's cell bodies and dendrites and unmyelinated axons. And then you also have within your cerebrum these so-called subcortical nuclei, right? If this is the cortex, these are subcortical, and they're nuclei. Those are groups of neurons that have a particular function, right? Certain input, certain output. So we'll kind of go over those, but that's just the big picture of here. And you can contrast this with the spinal cord. Remember, we had the spinal cord had that. It's just the section like this, and it had that butterfly shape of gray matter and then white matter all around it, right? For the cortex, Though you do have something like that, here's the gray matter under here, but then you have this outside layer of gray matter in the cortex, making up the cortex basically. All right, so that's the general organization of this coronal section. Oh, also, you're also going to see these big spaces over here. These are going to be the ventricles. This is going to be where cerebral spinal fluid is made and filled and everything, but we'll get back to that a little later. All right, so again, cerebral cortex. The cortex is the gray matter that forms the outer rim right here. It's a very thin layer, like only less than 0.16 inches to 2 to 4 millimeters at the surface right here. And this will come in these layers, right? And this is where all your neurons are, right? Billions and billions of neurons. They're only showing a couple here, but all they're doing over here is they're talking to each other. They're talking to different regions, and they're computing stuff. They're analyzing stuff. They're analyzing all the sensory information that came in, and they're going to compute about what to do next and make long-term plannings and kind of coordinate all your body activities, right? So this is where all your deep thought and consciousness is going on in this little strip of cerebral cortex. This is all your consciousness. And this is the area most expanded, right, in humans, right, compared to other animals, right? Animals, any kind of animal you could think of, a rat has the exact same kind of organization as this. A dolphin does, an elephant does, right? They all have the same kind of things. What we have more than any other animal is just a hell of a lot more of this, a lot more surface area here. But that's your cortex. And then you have those nuclei again, basal nuclei, these subcortical gray matter deep within the cerebrum, right? We'll talk about this basal nuclei here called the basal ganglia. Don't worry about it. All right. Okay. Cortex. And just as far as your terminology goes, right? Again, your brain is in the fetus. It's expanding, and this thing, your cerebrum, your telencephalon, is the one that's going crazy. It's expanding, and it's expanding so much that it can't fit anymore. Or your brain, you'd have you'd be like a gigantic. You'd have a gigantic head, right? If it was like, you'd be like a little baby like this. If it was allowed to expand without these folds being created right here. Okay, so these folds over here have names. The folds themselves are called the gyri, or a singular, that's the plural, singular gyrus over here, right? And then that gray matter would be within the gyrus as well as down within the sulci, the grooves over here. Right, so this is the sulcus. The bumps on the surface are the gyri. This is a gyrus. This is a individual sulcus. The shallow grooves. And then you had very deep grooves known as fissures, right? Just deeper ones dividing, major portions of the brain. Right? But these are the folds and everything, the wrinkly surface that we see on the cerebrum. Fissure, deep sulcus. So the question is, as I've already hinted at, why do we have all these folds? Right? I just showed you the big baby head to give you a clue. But basically, if there is that giant southwestern muscular ginormous, right? This mouse that's 6 feet, his brain is as big as us. And if you looked at his brain, the same size brain, pound for pound, he's got a very smooth surface, right, on this area right here.
It's 18h15.
Right, this is his cerebrum over here. This is our cerebrum. Notice, even though they have the same overall volume, if his skull was the same as ours, we have a lot more surface area, right? We're increasing our surface areas vastly. As I said, like if you unfolded this, it might come out to a size of a newspaper. If you unfolded this, it would be like the size of your classroom blackboard, right? Because of all these folds. In fact, 2/3 of your neocortex, that is that outside gray matter, are within all these little folds as they go down. And I'm lying, there's no actually 6-foot mouse, in case you're wondering, but that's the general picture, right? Smooth brain, no folds, right? They have a cortex. If you looked at it, it would look like that layered with the neurons and stuff, but there just wouldn't be that much of it. So we have this massive processing power increase, right? Computing power, CPUs, megabytes, whatever you want to call it, gigabytes, tegabytes. That's what we have. More processing power, more ability to analyze stuff, more ability to kind of make things happen, more ability to imagine stuff, whatever we do. Right? So much more complexity because that extra surface area. All right, so that's the folds of the brain that we see. And then as far as all these particular, there's a couple named folds and fissures, right? Your longitudinal fissure that's splitting the right and left, or left and right hemispheres, right, is going to, well, that's the longitudinal fissure. That's the most major one, going down from the anterior to the posterior, splitting the right and left. And the brains are not completely split. By the way, there will be this white matter connection in between them, but that is a major division in between these right and left halves of your cerebrum. And then looking from the lateral, you'll see this lateral sulcus over here that's separating the frontal lobe and a little bit of the parietal lobe from your temporal lobe right here. That'll be your lateral cerebral sulcus, or lateral sulcus is usually called, right? And then the other one, there is a couple here I'm not going to worry about, but the other major one over here is this transverse fissure, which separates your cerebrum from your cerebellum, right? The small brain over here. So transverse versus lateral. Sometimes this is called horizontal, I think, in some books, but lateral, transverse. And the other one, which you won't actually ever be able to see unless it's on a model that has this colored in, is this central sulcus, right? This groove that's running and separating the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe right here. And that's going to be a major division between anterior brain and posterior brain. That central sulcus. So you'll notice, if you remember anything from our skull stuff, these have the same names, the lobes, this region of the brain, your frontal lobe, right? Your parietal lobe, your occipital lobe, your temporal lobe, all those corresponded with and they're going to correspond with those areas of the skull that it sat in, right? So those are the lobes you have, and we'll talk a little bit about the functions of each one of those later. Right. And then the other thing which we'll see around the central sulcus on each side of these are gyri that have known specific functions, which we'll talk about. Right. We already talked about that primary somatosensory cortex with the sensory homunculus that was sitting right along here on the post-central gyri. And then we'll have a primary motor cortex on the other side of that. All right, so the next thing I want to briefly mention here is the white matter within the brain. There's a couple of named sort of basic types of tracks running to and fro and across the brain, right? So again, the cortex, you can see on the outside, but you know, the bulk of this, that's just a thin layer. All the rest of it is communication between different parts of the brain right over here, right? So what we'll see is that there will be connections within the hemisphere, connections from one hemisphere to another, and connections from the cerebrum down to other subcortical and lower brain areas, right? So the names which you'd want to know are association fibers, and these are going to be connecting within hemispheres, connecting these little different regions of the brain within the, say, right hemisphere. Those are going to be called dissociation or arcuate fibers, they're sometimes called. And then you have commiseral fibers, which are going to connect the left and right hemispheres. And the big one you'll know is the corpus callosum. Right? That'll be a major landmark and something to identify at some point, right? Because it'll connect this, and we'll see this big white matter stripped, and it'll be a good orientation point, the corpus callosum, connecting right between the hemispheres. And then we'll have these other ones that are going, this is the kind of those sensory fibers coming in, motor fiber, the motor pathway going down, right? All these projection fibers, the cerebral cortex coming into the cerebral cortex and leaving the cerebral cortex. These are projection fibers. All right, so these are the white matter tracks that you want to know right there. And the book has a little bit more detail if you're interested, but that's basically what you want to know. Within hemispheres, between hemispheres, and to and from lower areas. All right, so next, we're going to go back to the cortex here and talk about these functional regions, right? Parietal, frontal, occipital lobes, right? And all these are going to, they've all been mapped out, right? And you can think of them, these very broad sort of regions right here, right? We got a, we got a left. I think this is left. This is probably a right one. No, this is left since we're looking down. A left and a right. That's the easy division for this brain. But we also are going to kind of divide the brain somewhere along here and over here. That is into anterior and posterior. And you're going to want to associate this with motor and this with sensory, as we will see. Right? That's the big other division of the brain, the biggest broad thing we can think of here, besides left and right. So again, when we go into all this, we kind of thinking of the neural reflexes, sensory input. You see a glass of water, you pick up you grab for the glass of water, right? There's a whole lot of stuff between this striking the back of the eyeball and this action, this so-called integration of what's happening right here. That's all going to be happening. I shouldn't say all. The major parts of it, the most complex parts of it, are happening in the cerebrum. And again, most of it, all this high-level stuff what we're going to be talk about here is happening in that little strip of gray matter, the cortex. And again, this is where humans are most different from any other animals, right? We just have this massively expanded cortical area right here due to all these folds right here. Other social animals like primates, even dolphins and elephants, also have a pretty developed cortex. It has a lot to do with our sociality, but for us, we have this whole language thing and really high level abstract thinking stuff. So again, the basic division we want to think of when we're talking about the cerebrum and these functional regions, right, is the anterior versus posterior sides. Kind of like in the spinal cord, right? We had anterior was motor stuff, the ventral, right? Anterior and ventral, the ventral horn, motor nuclei, the ventral root. And then on the other side, we had the dorsal horn or posterior horn and the dorsal root ganglia, all the posterior. It's kind of the same, it's a little bit of the same pattern here. The anterior side of your brain is going to be involved in motor output. And it's going to do all the big planning and everything like that, and then actually send out the commands, whereas this is going to be receiving all the sensory information and making sense of the world over here. It's going to get that sensory input, integrate it, and make sense to you, whoever you are. And your motor information is going to kind of control everything else. And this is going to be your major division between your anterior and your posterior.